The American Indian Movement Stand at Wounded Knee by Alex McKeever and Benjamin Sampson. The United States is a fake country. Russell Means.
I paraphrase the former Secretary of the Department of the Interior, James Watt. If you want to see an example of failed socialism, go to an Indian reservation.
In 1969, the American Indian Movement was formed in Minneapolis, Minnesota to promote Native American rights. American Indian Movement's most impactful protest occurred on the Wounded Knee Indian Reservation in 1973, where members of AIM took 11 hostages. Soon after, a conflict erupted between Native Americans and United States Authority. After a 71-day standoff, a compromise to end the fighting occurred on the terms that the government would investigate broken treaties and the American Indian Movement would release the hostages. In the wake of the protest, many laws were passed to help establish equal rights for Native Americans. Before the creation of the American Indian Movement, Native Americans had been subjected to terrible treatments. Through trading, white settlers exchanged goods contaminated with various diseases for animal skins and pelts. These contaminated goods would later cause many deaths among Native Americans. Following this, natives were forced to participate in a brutal march, which would later be called the Trail of Tears. White settlers wanted the land Native Americans lived on because of the rich soil that lent itself to growing crops. They wanted the land so desperately, they forced the Native Americans to leave their own home. They also believed that Native Americans should become civilized and more like the white settlers. The Trail of Tears forced many Cherokee and members of other tribes to be forcibly removed from their homes and brought along deadly trails where thousands of Native Americans died because of the harsh conditions. This new land Native Americans were now forced to live on was located in what is now known as the Midwest. This new land was obtained during the Louisiana Purchase and was poor quality land for farming. With very little food, water, and ways to make money to purchase things necessary for them to live, Native Americans were in dire straits and could barely survive. Despite many Native Americans dying because of the lack of resources, white settlers still hated Native Americans and still thought they should be civilized like themselves.
Of America. In these United States of America, this great country of ours, we American Indians, we can be anything we want to be, except American Indians. And that is created by the laws of this nation and condoned by its subsidiaries, the so-called tribal government, and designed for the Indian to fail, to be expendable, to be eliminated.
This grudge sparked years of conflict and wars, including the massacre at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in late December of 1890. Members of the United States government were very concerned. The members of the Pine Ridge Reservation were getting very upset and were going to revolt because of the horrible conditions that would anger the Native American gods. Then the government arrested and killed Chief Sitting Bull, causing tensions to rise even higher. The army then forced Native Americans to surrender weapons so revolt would not occur. Ironically, a shot was fired while Native Americans were surrendering, the weapons causing massive fighting to ensue. About 200 Native Americans were slaughtered and approximately 25 men of the army were killed. Even more astonishing was the fact that over 50% of the Native Americans killed in the massacre were children and women. Native Americans were outraged at this massacre because it had killed so many. This massacre at Wounded Knee made the area a significant location for where more treaties and trusts were broken. Pine Ridge Reservation would become a central location where more conflict and hopefully compromise could occur in the next century. In July 1968, Native Americans were fed up with broken treaties and came together to form the American Indian Movement. This organization's goal were to promote Native American rights and fight against police brutality. The American Indian Movement brought awareness to their cause through many different protests. Both peaceful and violent protests occurred before the incident at Wounded Knee. Native Americans were angry at pioneers and other officials in the 1900s because of how badly they were treated and how the treaties between the two parties were broken. The American Indian Movement was an organization dedicated to making sure they were treated equally to white people, no matter the hardship they would have to endure on the road to equality. The American Indian Movement originally tried multiple times to negotiate with Americans to have equal rights. However, the American Indian Movement was barely acknowledged and nothing was changed to improve the equality among Native Americans. As a result, Native Americans were very upset because not only were many treaties and truces broken, but even now a compromise could not be put in place. In light of this, approximately 100 members of the American Indian Movement took a boat to Alcatraz and claimed it a reservation by the right of discovery. They demanded the government to fund it as an Indian reservation because it would be the proper thing to do. However, the government denied it and tried to forcibly remove the natives. In defiance, natives fought back and refused to leave. By doing this, the American Indian movement created more conflict and spread awareness of their cause. However, a compromise was still not reached. In late February of 1973, leaders of the American Indian movement, including Russell Means, one of the main founders of the American Indian movement, and other members of the movement, went to the site of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Hundreds of other Sioux tribe members that lived on the reservation went to the American Indian movement to protest the lack of equality for Native Americans. The conflict between the Native Americans and the United States law enforcement was imminent. This protest was impactful to helping Native Americans gain equal rights, and it also had a lot of meaning of it being at Wounded Knee. This was the site of the Wounded Knee massacre where hundreds of Native Americans were slaughtered in 1890. It was also one of the poorest Indian reservations at the time with a very short life expectancy. Armed members of the American Indian movement took 11 hostages that lived in the community. As many federal agents arrived at the scene, several shots were fired by opposing sides, causing a standoff between the agents and the Native Americans for the next 71 days at Wounded Knee. Even though many people were harmed during this protest, Means and the government were about to put a compromise in place to stop the fighting and make things better for both parties of the conflict. As a result of the American Indian movement's stand at Wounded Knee, 2 members of the Sioux tribe were killed and 1 federal agent was permanently paralyzed after being shot in his spinal cord. During the last few days at the standoff at Wounded Knee, Russell Means and the United States federal agents created a compromise to help people from both sides. The American Indian movement and other Sioux members would release the 11 hostages they took captive if the federal agents would launch investigations into broken treaties. However, the United States government arrests Russell Means after the compromise for leading this conspiracy and assault against the United States. He would later be acquitted from the charge of conspiracy with a 12-0 vote. However, one of the jury members had a stroke and the U.S. government would not accept a jury of 11 members for the vote for assault. After 8.5 months of court trials, the presiding judge, Fred Joseph Nichol, dismissed Means' charges for assault, letting him go free. Life would soon start to pick up for many Native Americans, but many would not live to see it. The American Indian movement's occupation at Wounded Knee provided motivation for the United States government to pass laws to help Native Americans. In 1970, the budget for healthcare for Native Americans was a little less than $107 million. However, the budget for healthcare for everyone else was about $75 billion. This is around 750 times more money for non-Native Americans. However, in 1976, the healthcare budget for Native Americans increased by nearly 4,000%, making it $4 billion. Also, in 1975, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act of 1975 was established and passed into law. This law started to allow Native Americans to govern themselves and to reduce government interference within Indian reservations and communities. A few years later, in 1978, Congress passed the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. In doing this, Native Americans were now allowed to practice their own religion and perform sacred ceremonies legally. The American Indian movement was a successful group. Even after the Battle of Wounded Knee had occurred, there were still a few Native American protests. Throughout the rest of the 1970s, there were still shootouts between the American Indian movement and the United States government. In one particular shootout, 2 FBI agents died and 1 American Indian movement member was also killed. Russell Means was the leader of the American Indian movement during the Wounded Knee incident. After the incident, Means went on to act in movies, write books, and even run for president. Means was proof that the American Indian movement was run by smart and capable people, and that's why Wounded Knee was a successful protest. After the 20th century, the American Indian movement is no longer as necessary. The American Indian movement was very efficient and active in the 1970s and 1980s. Their need has diminished over time. They were able to successfully help the Native Americans in gaining equal rights. As you can see, the American Indian movement's protest at Wounded Knee in 1973 was very successful in helping Native Americans gain equality. After taking hostage, losing lives, and firing weapons in the 71-day standoff, the American Indian movement was able to reach compromise with the United States government to free hostages and help Native Americans be equal.